So, hi there, everybody. My name's Sarah Young, and today I'm going to talk to you about data lifecycle management. So, let's get into it. So, first of all, this is the agenda for today. I'm going to talk about who I am. Who am I? We'll talk about what data lifecycle management is. We'll talk about configuring retention policies, applying retention labels, and then last but not least, we'll round it off today with talking about importing data for data lifecycle management. So that's importing data from outside the cloud into Purview and the Office 365 environment so we can do data lifecycle management. So let's get into it. First of all, who am I? I'm a senior cloud security advocate at Microsoft. I've worked in security for about the last 10 years. I say that I've been in security since before it was cool. As we know, security is now very cool. I love talking about how we can secure everything because securing things is so important. I also wrote a couple of MS Press books. I wrote the SC100. I co-wrote the SC100 guide and the SC200 guide. So if you're interested in taking those exams, go check them out. Obviously, I'm biased, but I very much recommend them. I'm also a co-host of the Azure Security podcast, which has been running amazingly for about 3 years now, and which still blows my mind. And unsurprisingly, we talk about lots of Azure things. So, definitely if you're doing Azure security, we invite a lot of Microsoft friends to come talk to us about the cool things. The crazy dog woman, these are my dogs. This is us in Melbourne over the summer. They're very cute. They know they're cute. So yeah. So just for a level set, before we go any further, what is data cycle life management and why should we care about it? I think the first thing I want to say here is that a lot of people think the data lifecycle management is just for compliance. It's not a security problem. It's just about complying with regular. Because of course, most organizations now, no matter what industry vertical you are, or no matter where you are in the world, you will probably be subject to some kind of data lifecycle management rules. So, it might be you can only keep data for 7 years. You can only keep data for as long as you absolutely need it for. Again, there are different regulations in different parts of the world. However, it is a security issue too. So you may be aware that recently here in Australia, where I am, towards the end of last year, we had a number of high-profile breaches with some big companies here in Australia. And what happened, what actually came out of that was one of those breaches showed that one of those organizations had been holding data on people who hadn't been customers of that organization for a very, very long time, which obviously meant their data lifecycle management was not very effective, or there was something had gone wrong there. So not only did they deal with a breach, but they were actually dealing with breaches of more people's data than their current customers. And so it actually having an ineffective data lifecycle management process actually does increase your attack vector, your attack surface, sorry, because there are so many different things that these attackers, all this data, the more data you have, the worse the data breach will be. And not only are there it's not just about adhering to regulations and maybe getting fines. It is actually a problem from a security perspective too. Just wanted to say that before we get into it. So, in fact, this is a very busy slide. I probably need to make it less busy, but Purview Lifecycle Management is the Purview solution for managing data throughout its life cycle, for when you collect it, you store it, and then when you get rid of it. So we use retention policies to help you do that. They pretty much do what they say on the tin, and that's what we're going to be talking about a lot today. And you can take a couple of different approaches to how you do that retention. You can either do it organizational wide, or you can use policies that will, depending on the different attributes of a file or data, will label it with a particular retention policy. So as I was saying before, of course, it is a compliance issue. Your organization is probably subject to various different regulations. So of course there's GDPR, and if you've got EU data, there's HIPAA if you have healthcare in the US, and there's many other ones there as well. And yeah, retention policies will help you retain content for as long as you need it, but no longer. So that's the really important thing, because we know, and I'm sure we all know, that this isn't going to happen manually. Do you go through and delete things when you've kept them for too long? No, it's not possible with the crazy amount of data that we have nowadays. It's not realistic that anyone can do this manually, and so we have to use tooling and policies to be able to help us do that. And I'm going to get into that in the next few slides. So this might sound a little bit intense to go into straight away, but it's really, really important. And I wanted to talk about retention policy precedence, which one goes first, because this is really important to understanding how we do labeling within Purview. So first, as you can see there, retention wins over deletion. So if there are multiple policies that a piece of data could be subject to, if it's inherited multiple things, if one says to delete your email after 3 years and one says delete after 5 years or retain until 5 years, when the content reaches 3 years old, we will delete it and it will be hidden, but it's still going to be in the recoverable items for the next 2 years. Retention always wins over deletion. And content that is retained by one policy can never be deleted by another policy whilst that policy is still in effect. So that's an important one to know. The next one is longest retention period wins. So if content is subject to multiple policies that retain content, it will be retained until the end of the longest retention period. So which makes sense, right? So if it's subject to a number of policies, one that says keep it for 2 years and one that says keep it for 10 years, we're always going to use the 10-year one because that is the longest period. The next one is explicit inclusion wins over implicit inclusion. So what that means is if you have explicitly labeled a piece of data with a particular policy, and it is inherited a policy because it's an exchange, because it's in OneDrive, or because it meets certain attributes, the policy where you have specifically put it on that data, that will always win over because you have explicitly given that policy to that data. So again, I know that we're getting sort of into a bit of depth here straight away, but it is important to understand how the principles work. And then last but not least, shortest deletion period wins. So again, if a content is subject to multiple policies that delete content with no retention, it will be deleted at the end of the shortest retention period. So yeah, and if there are multiple things, multiple retention things going on, this is the order that we go down them. So if you used to doing old school network or router or firewall configuration, you may remember access control lists or ACLs where we would have allow, deny, and it would go down in order of precedence. And then when we get right to the bottom, there was an explicit deny any. I think of it a little bit like that. For those of you who are old enough or were working in the time where we used ACLs and firewalls. Naturally, we still do. So Not that this is my area of complete expertise, but it's always something to consider. And when we're doing an overview of a capability, it's important to talk about it. But this is just how it breaks down in terms of a licensing perspective. So there is overlap between data lifecycle management and records management. As you can see on the diagram, both solutions support retention and deletion of data for Microsoft 365's apps and services, but data lifecycle management will also look at workloads and mailboxes, archive mailboxes, and then in records management, we have things like disposition review, which I'm going to talk about just in a second. But again, just because there's a bit of overlap there, I'd like to put it visually on the screen for you, just so you can understand if you're looking at the licensing side of things, what features you get when you pay for what. So next we have the Purview Data Lifecycle Management Overview. This is just to dig into it a little bit more. So as I was saying, if you are using the Purview Data Lifecycle Management licensing, it will let you, it will do the retention policies of Microsoft 365. It allows you to retain mailbox content. It will also allow you to archive mailboxes, and it will import things for PST files. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. It is something that some folks need, but again, just wanted to give you a rundown of how that licensing breaks down. And then for records management, we can create retention labels interactively or in bulk. We can put retention labels on individual items. We can put them on. We can make retention policies, and then we can do disposition review. And disposition review, just to explain what this one is, we won't go into it today, but disposition review is when you can add a disposition review at the end of a retention policy. So say you have a record, it's configured to be kept for 3 years. It reaches the end of that 3 years. If it's got a policy that says trigger a disposition review, what will happen is the owner of that file will actually get a notification saying, this file, this content has come to the end of its retention period. What do you want to do with it? So it actually allows you to have an extra check before something is deleted, which I know is something that a lot of organizations like, because it gives them more confidence that they're doing things properly, and they just want that extra check before they get rid of something. So disposition reviews are really helpful, and especially when you're getting into the swing of doing lifecycle management, if it's not something your organization has done too much before, it can really help give people confidence that they're not accidentally deleting something that they shouldn't do. Right then, so let's get into it. Let's actually look, well, first of all, I'm going to talk you through how we configure a retention policy, and then we'll have a look in the demo and actually have a go at doing it. So let's hope that the demo gods are going to be kind to me today. So it's actually really straightforward. When we configure a retention policy, we go into the compliance portal, we click on data lifecycle management, we're going to name the policy, we're going to put some settings into it and some attributes, we're going to choose the locations we want to apply that policy to, and then we'll review the settings and create the policy. So much nicer to see this in a demo. So let's have a look. So to start with, I'm going to go to data lifecycle management. So we have to click on Office 365, and we will go to policies now. I'll click on policies here, and I'm going to click on new retention policy. So I'll call this Sarah's test policy number 2. This is my second one in this. So now we have to choose the type of retention policy that we want to create. So there are 2 options here. We have adaptive and we have static. Now, static sort of does what it says on the tin. You will define some locations, and this policy will be applied to those locations. If those locations change or they grow, you will have to go in and manually amend this policy. It's going to stay exactly as you configured it. Whereas with adaptive, you can actually pick a scope. Now, I'm not going to get into defining a scope today just because of time, but essentially you pick a scope and the scope consists of attributes and properties. Again, they can be lots of different things. And as the data changes and moves and is added to in your organization, the adaptive policy will look at the attributes of what is added, and where appropriate, it will start labeling or it will start putting the policy across those new things. I 100% recommend you use adaptive where you can. And the reason for that is that no organization stays the same. Your data, your environment, it's changing all the time, right? And we know we don't have enough people in security. We have a massive shortage of skill. And so increasing the workload of your people who are doing your data lifecycle management by making them go back in and change these static policies is an overhead that you really don't need. So of course there will always be edge cases, which is why we have static as an option. But for the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of use cases, I strongly recommend you use adaptive. And this goes for everything else I'm going to show you, where we have an option between adaptive and static. So on that, I'm going to pick adaptive. Now, first thing we have to do when it's adaptive is we have to pick a scope. So it's going to show me my scopes in a second. Now I only have one in this demo environment, so we'll add that. And now you can see that we can choose locations to apply the policy to. So I'm just going to leave it with Exchange mailboxes and OneDrive. But you can see we could also put this across Yammer and Teams as well. And then we've got to decide what we want to do with this retention. So, do we want to retain the content? Do we want to delete it, or both? So you can see here on the radio buttons, I can retain the items for a specific period. So I could do it for 5 years, 10 years. Let's do 10 years. And then here we have to pick between start the retention period when items were created and start it when they were last modified. So that's similar, but but different and in an important way. So when an item was created, that date is never going to change. But when an item was modified, essentially every time you modify that data, the counter for the retention period will be reset. So again, for this one, I can't tell you what's right or wrong. That's going to depend on your organization's retention policy and what regulations you're subject to. But we do give you the option, so you can pick. And then you can see at the end of the retention period, we can say delete items automatically. We can also say do nothing. But being that we're doing data lifecycle management, you probably aren't going to use that too much. But hey, and we have some other options there as well. So we do, as you may be familiar with, if you've been using lots of Microsoft things, we have a review and finish page, so we can review everything we've put in. And then down at the bottom here, this is really important to know. It's saying that items that are currently older than 10 years will be permanently deleted after you turn on this policy. So as soon as we turn on this policy, it's going to start looking at the data that it can see and that it has in its scope. And if there is data in there that is more than 10 years old, it's going to start deleting it. So that's really important to understand, that it doesn't just look at the data from the point in time that the policy is set up. So really important to remember, because of course, if you don't realize that, or that's not what you want to do, you could end up accidentally deleting some data. But the great thing about that as well, on the conversely, is that if you've never done data lifecycle management before and you're just implementing it, this policy will go back and it's going to look at everything that's currently in your environment, subject to the scope that you've picked, which means it can actually tidy up things. So there's good and bad to it, but it's just something to be aware of. So I'm going to hit submit, and it's thinking about it. It's going to go create my retention policy, hopefully. You also notice, there we go. You've successfully created a retention policy. You may also have noticed just there, which I didn't quite finish, it does say that it can take up to a week for the policy to be fully in effect, because it does take a little while, of course, for us to search through all of that data. So it's not like as soon as you apply the policy, you'll suddenly see everything older than 10 years disappear. As it said there, it can take up to a week. Okay, and if we go back now, and I'm going to hit refresh on our retention policies, and you can see here we have Sarah's test policy number 2. And we can see that we can see all the settings there as well. So there we go. We've got that one all done. So going back, that was our demo. Didn't quite get to the right slide there. So now let's have a look at applying retention labels. So slightly different, but not much. As you know, we try and keep things to as much as we can repetitive and familiar, because it makes it easier for people to use them. So for applying a retention label, we're going to give the label a name, configure the settings, and review those settings. Now, just before we go and look at the demo, though, there's a couple of things that it is important to remember about retention labels. When you're creating a label rather than a policy, it's the first step in a 2-step process. You create the label, and then you have to publish it or auto-apply it. Like, it doesn't just start doing things without the retention label doing something. You can't change the name after they've been created. So if you don't like the name later, or you make a mistake, you will have to delete it and just do another one. And you can only assign one retention label to content at a time. And auto-applied retention labels will be replaced if you manually apply a retention label. I'll let you read the other ones. And retention label policies can trigger a disposition review, which is what I talked about earlier. Retention policies can't. So again, that's something that's important to understand. So looking at manual retention label policies, we choose some labels to publish. We publish them to user or groups, we name the policy, and we review those settings. So, and then to auto apply, we're going to choose the type of label we want to auto apply, choose the conditions in which we will apply it, add in the various settings, name the policy, put it in locations, and review the settings. So I'm going to show you manual retention label policies first. So let's go back to the demo and let's have a look at those. Let's have a look at those label policies. Now, we're going to publish some labels. So I'm going to click publish. We're going to choose the labels that we'd like to publish. So I'm going to pick let's see, Sarah's label. Let's pick this one. So I'm going to add that here. You can see it's given us a summary of what the label actually is. I'm going to hit next. Now, again, we have adaptive or static. I've already explained the difference between them. As I said, I always recommend that you use adaptive unless you have a specific use case. And then we're going to add a scope. And then we're going to do their test policy. There we go. So we're publishing that now. And have a look. So we've got that all done there. So next up, we'll look at auto applying. So slightly different this time. We have a look at auto applying. We're going to give it a name. Test, test, test. So you can see here, we're going to choose the type of content you want to apply this label to. So there's applying label content to sensitive information. We can configure it to apply to specific words and phrases. We can use a trainable classifier, which is a machine learning model that will learn different types of data. Or we can just do it to attachments and links. Now I'm going to keep it at sensitive information. So in Purview, we have over 200 predefined categories of sensitive data. They're from different industry verticals and they're from different parts of the world. As you can see here in the categories, we have financial, medical and health, privacy, custom. We've got different countries we can pick from too. So I'm going to look at what we have in Australia here, because that's where I am. And let's have a look at medical. So we can see here, we have the Australia Health Workers Act. And it's got defined in this template, the Australian tax file number, your Medicare account, well, it's actually called Medicare, but your medical account number, full names, medical terms and conditions, and physical addresses. So let's do that. So what we're saying here is that we're going to use this template, and then we're going to label anything that looks like, with my label, that is going to that looks like Australian health data. We're going to put my label on it. Again, talked about adaptive and static. I'm going to pick adaptive. I'll pick our agency scope again. And then this time, this is something that is going to be applied to OneDrive accounts. And then we've got to pick the label that we wanted to auto apply. So I'm going to use Sarah's label again there. So this is the one that we're going to use, which is keep for 7 years and then delete. And then there's two options here as well. So we can either test the policy before running it or turn on the policy. So essentially what that means is you can test it and it's just going to show you examples of the content that fits your policy's conditions, which means it's actually not going to apply the labels. You can't accidentally delete something. It's like the safe option, particularly if you're new to data lifecycle management and you just want to run it in a bit of a test mode to start with, which is completely understandable. So for this one though, I'm going to use turn on policy because I'm confident that I've got it right, and we can review it again, and I'm going to submit that policy. So we'll just wait for that. And then of course, because I've picked enforce or the do it in real life, this policy is going to start taking effect straight away. And we can see there's my test, which is auto apply. And of course, the other one we had there was the publish as well, which is the one that I did before. So Sarah's test policy here. So that's how you apply retention labels. And then the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up, now I'm not going to demonstrate this, I'm just going to talk about it, is importing data for data lifecycle management. Now, this is, I alluded to this towards the beginning of the talk. Sometimes, well, many organizations have data that is not, it isn't in their, it's not in their cloud, it's still on premise. Now, unlike some of the other tools and other functions that we have, in order to do retention and deleting, we do need to have a level of control of those files, which means they do need to be in the cloud control plane. So in order to do that, we need to actually import the data into the cloud. I know for other parts of Microsoft and other parts of Azure, we actually have tooling that means we don't have to do that. But specifically for data lifecycle management, we do. So there's two things that you may want to import. PST files, so of course archive mailboxes, and then there may be other third-party data as well. Now, of course, these files could be significant if they're archived and you're keeping them for a while. You could have gigabytes, terabytes, even more petabytes of data that need to go into the cloud. So there's two ways that we can do this. You can do a network upload and upload them into a temporary Azure storage location, and then you can use the Office 365 import feature to bring the data in, and then you can do your labeling and classification and retention as required. Now, if you have petabytes and petabytes of data, that might not be practical, because although bandwidth has greatly improved, that's still an awful lot of data to upload. If that's the case, then Microsoft does offer drive shipping. So essentially, you copy the files that you want to upload onto a BitLocker encrypted drive and send it to Microsoft. And then when it gets to us, our data center personnel will upload it into the cloud for you. Of course, we can upload it in quicker ways. It will then go to a temporary Azure storage location, and then you can import it using Office 365 and do what you got to do. So there are your options as well. As I said, that's a bit difficult for me to actually do for a demo. I don't have some legacy PST files hanging around, but as soon as you've imported it, then it behaves like everything else. You can apply labels, we can apply policies, and we can look to sort out your retention piece there as well. So there's a couple of different options if that's something that you need to do, because of course we don't want to forget about on-prem. On-prem is still important. On-prem isn't going away for the majority of people unless you're an organization that was born in the cloud in the last maybe 5, 6, 7 years. So, we want to be able to cater for that too. And with that, that's actually the end of my presentation. It's a bit of a just nice, quick, short and sharp overview of data lifecycle management and why it's really important. Thank you all for listening and for your attention. Of course, if you've got any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Blue Sky, and have a great rest of your conference. And thanks for having me.